wanted to take advantage of this podcast to make people aware that adoption is an opportunity to give a child in need a forever home, a forever family. I was invited to come and speak before 3 or 4 couples, all Japanese, and I was very encouraged because awareness and that acceptance is starting to grow little by little.
Hey there, and thank you for tuning in. We're excited to bring you another great conversation today. If you like the show and want to support us, please hit the subscribe button so we can keep bringing you great content week after week. And if you're feeling extra generous, give this video a like and share your thoughts and comments down below. Thank you so much. And now, let's get into it. Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and in the studio today we welcome Andrew. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
You've been in Japan or coming to Japan for over 40 years, and you're here today to talk to us about your journey to becoming an adoptive parent here.
Yes.
A few years ago, quite a few years ago, you've adopted a son in Japan, and it's quite a unique story you want to share with us today and a look into the world of adoption and adoptive children here in Japan. But before we dive into this, I'm curious about what brought you here to Japan 41 years ago.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I was thinking about different ways of answering this, but I didn't want to say that Japan, really appealed to me in the culture and all of that, which it does, but it's also a very typical answer. For me, I've always liked foreign language. When I was 9, my dad was doing research in Europe. And he had some phrase books, and one of them was a Dutch phrase book. So I tried to teach myself Dutch at the age of 9. Yes.
Dutch.
In junior high and high school, I studied French and German. And then when I entered college at UC Davis, a friend of my dad's, this was the early 80s, so Japan was very hot at that time. A friend of my dad's suggested that I take Japanese. And I knew nothing about Japan. And I said, well, okay, I'll do this. And I took a quarter of Japanese. And I was about to leave at the end of that first quarter. And luckily, my sensei, my teacher, said, you've only just scratched the surface, so I think you should stay. And that was a big turning point in not just my career, but my life. And so then the appeal of the Japanese language just flowered for me. And so I became very serious about it. And because it was a difficult language, it became more of a challenge to me to master it as much as I could. And I think that the other thing that appealed to me is the writing system. Because to me, it's kind of like an artwork or like drawing they are pictographs. It's like drawing pictures. But also because of when I learned Japanese, this was the early 80s. Of course, there was no word processing. So everything was handwritten. And so having that sort of hand-mind connection was very, very strong for me with Japanese, more than other languages using Western alphabets. So after 2 years of studying Japanese at UC Davis, I came to International Christian University, or ICU, in Tokyo, and lived on campus for a year. And it was during that time that I decided this was a place where I wanted to live and work in the future. But at that time, I decided I was not going to follow 3 common paths. I was not going to be sort of I didn't want to be an English teacher. I was not going to come to Japan to work in proselytizing religion. And also, I didn't want to be involved in the entertainment industry as some sort of person who comes onto these game shows and gives their opinions about Japan, Western life, even though they may or may not be qualified. So I wanted to really find work in Japan that relied on my language ability and skill set. So I started out as a translator, and then eventually that morphed into project management, and it's something that I am still doing to this day.
What part of your experience at university in Tokyo got you to realize Japan is a place I want to live for much longer than just an exchange?
That's a very good question. So when I was at UC Davis, I didn't live in the dormitories. And as you are probably familiar with the US system, it's a place where people live for a year or maybe two, and then they move out and into an apartment with friends. My dormitory at ICU, it was a rather old-fashioned arrangement. So they had 3 men's dormitories on one side of the campus and 4 women's dormitories on the other side of the campus. And it was a very chaste arrangement. And the residents of those dormitories typically lived there for 4 years. And when I was living there, there were about 40 people in our building. So it's more like a fraternity, both good side and bad side. The good side was that it was a place where we lived very closely together and formed very close friendships. So I'm still in touch with many of my friends since that time. So one of my friends from the dormitory, his wife, who's Japanese, she is the guarantor for my apartment, for example.
Wow.
And then another friend, his daughter, when she was applying to university here in Japan, she needed to pass the interview for the ACAN, the English exam. So I coached her on that. So we have very continuing relationships, which are very fascinating. Did you want to ask me something?
So the 80s,
Yes.
Japan was very hot at the time.
Yes.
It's a period that I did not experience. I'm kind of curious, how was it for you when you were like down in the streets of Tokyo in the 80s? You said career-wise, you did not want to go into entertainment. You did not want to go into anything that's affiliated with promoting religion, and you did not want to be a teacher. So you went into translation. But what was the experience like living as a translator in Tokyo in the 80s?
It was a very different time. Japan was viewed as and was truly a very costly place to live. And then also moving into an apartment was extremely difficult, more difficult than nowadays.
Really?
And I'll tell you why. Because nowadays, for example, our current apartment, we had to put down, I think like 3 months for shikiking and reiking. In the 80s, it was 6 months.
6 months.
6 months was very common. This is a holdover from the post-World War II period where housing in Tokyo was very, very tight after the destruction of World War II. So many people started offering money to the landlords to move up on the list, as it were. And that tradition continued into the 80s. It was, looking back on it now, it was also a very old-fashioned time, surprisingly. For example, when we would board the train, there were none of these automated gates like you have nowadays. You had ticket agents at each wicket.
So like 5 guys standing next to each other.
5 guys were sitting there, and they had these little, they looked like pliers. They were, and they would punch a certain hole into your card. It had different shapes, so they could tell where you boarded and where you got off. See, I'm looking at your face, and you just think that's crazy. But
well, I'm trying to picture the scene right now, and I was just wondering, like, how many they probably like clip per day, and
they were very fast, and so you had that. For example, in my dormitory, we had one of our important duties was a phone duty. So we had a single kurodenwa in the reception room of the dormitory, and we sat there from about 8 in the morning until 8 at night. And when when someone would receive a call, then we would call upstairs and say, Tobias, you've got a call. But we had a system. So if you had a call from a male friend, you'd say, denwa desu, which means it's a call from a male. If it was a girl, you'd say, o denwa desu. And everyone in the dormitory would go, ooh, like, even though most of the time it wasn't, anything nearly that interesting. We had to share ofuro duty. So we would prepare the ofuro, and we only had hot water in the evenings from 6 p.m. until 10 p.m. because we had rationing for the gas used to heat the boiler. So, this must all seem very, very strange to someone who's come to Japan post 2000, where you have humans clipping your tickets at a train station. You have very limited hours for hot water, and you don't have your own mobile telephone. You have to use the telephone downstairs.
But that experience for you was kind of life-changing enough that you decided to continue living here and start your career.
Yes.
First in translation, nowadays in project management relating to IT.
Yes.
Today we want to dive a little bit more in something that came along the way, and that is the adoption of your son.
Yes.
At what point in your journey in living in Japan did the idea of adopting a child kind of come up?
That's a very good question. So actually, the idea of adopting a child from Japan came up when my wife and I were still living in the US. So this was early 2000s. We had gone through several cycles of fertility treatment, which were not successful. And one day, I remember the day exactly because it was the 4th of July in 2010, Independence Day in the United States. And we were in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time. We went to a friend's house, and this friend hosted a July 4th barbecue for a group that I used to belong to in San Francisco called San Francisco Japanese English Toastmasters, which was a public speaking club in Japanese and English. Fascinating club. Really interesting people. And we went to this barbecue, and some friends arrived at this party. One friend is Japanese American, and her husband is Indian, and they brought a beautiful little girl with them who looked to be biologically Japanese and Indian. And my wife and I were talking with them, and we said, "Oh, how old is she?" And they said, "Well, she's 18 months, but we've had her for 12 months." We were very confused. We said, "What happened to the first 6 months?" And they explained that they had adopted her from Japan. And when people talk to you about, seeing the light, or it was like that instantly for my wife and myself. And we'll get into the discussion later on in the interview, but we had assumed that since Japan has a low birth rate, that there are also no children to adopt from Japan. And also, we had considered adoption, but we couldn't feel it in our hearts. We could not see it. But upon seeing that little girl, we instantly saw it. And we've told this little girl, who's now a teenager, many times that for us, she is an angel on earth, because she had a profound effect on our lives and the life of our son. Because without her, none of this would have taken place.
I think it's wonderful in a way that you both felt the same when seeing that girl. I think if one parent sees that and feels one way and the other doesn't, it might be more difficult. But yes, you both had this sudden conviction that, okay, we should try to adopt a child from Japan. But you were living in the Bay Area at
yes,
the time. So I imagine that day on the 4th of July, you saw the light, but then came the reality of, okay, how does this actually work, right? How do you adopt a child in Japan when you're not even living there at the time?
Yes.
So how was your adoption process for you from there on?
Yes. So the very next day, through our friend's introduction, we contacted the agency in the Bay Area that handled international adoptions. And It was rather sobering because they informed us very clearly that we would be bottom of the list in terms of adopting a child from Japan. Nowadays, in-country adoptions are much more promoted, and rightly so. But there are four categories. It's a Japanese couple living in Japan, a Japanese couple living abroad, and a non-Japanese couple living in Japan, and then a non-Japanese couple not living in Japan is at the very bottom of the list. And we were told that it would probably be several years before we would be matched. So we went through a rather rigorous process. One is you have to be fingerprinted and cleared by the FBI in the United States.
Wow.
Because if you have any background of child abuse or any sort of crimes like that, you're disqualified. And you have to be fingerprinted. We had to have further background checks, had to have our home inspected. We had to provide financial statements, bank statements, pictures of our home, interviews. We were interviewed several times.
By the FBI?
By the adoption agency.
Okay.
We didn't have any direct interaction with the FBI other than checking our fingerprints and our background check. And also, if you've lived in multiple states in the United States, each state has its own child abuse database. So growing up, I had any state that you've lived in after the age of 18. So my wife and I had lived in several states in the United States. So we had to apply to New York State and the state of California, for example, and state of Pennsylvania. So that was rather tedious.
So this process up until that point, is this mandated by the American adoption agency, or is this something that the Japanese government put in place for monitoring and regulating adoptions of Japanese children?
This is pretty standard across adoptions, period, as far as I know. So it's not really that unique in terms of adopting from Japan in terms of the procedure and whatnot is not, in our case, was not that different from whether we had adopted in the US.
Because two things come to mind. One was recently, I think it was a lot in the news, the amount of children that were adopted from Korea.
Yes.
And that a lot of things were done not by following these kind of procedures. Children were taken or disappeared and reappeared elsewhere or or not. So I'm guessing this kind of helps to prevent these kind of situations by having this in place. But also, I was reading that actually Japan did not sign the Hague Convention for, I don't remember the name, it's a very long name, but it's relating to children.
Yes, it's the Hague Convention. It has a rather long name, which specifies all sorts of regulations related to adopting children. And Japan, as far as I know, is still not a signatory to the Hague Convention. The reason for that is that all the agencies that deal with adoption in that country have to be audited and have to comply. And I think that it hasn't been done in Japan, also partly because adopting children in Japan historically and culturally has not been a thing. So I don't think there's it's not seen as a need.
At that point in time, you're living in the United States, and you mentioned you're part of the fourth category, a non-Japanese couple living overseas. So I'm assuming your wife is also not Japanese.
No.
Why decide to adopt a child from Japan as opposed to one of the many children in foster homes in the United States, for example?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. In terms of, we'll touch on this too during today's interview. There's several points as in your journey to becoming an adoptive parent where you have to ask yourself some very hard questions. And and be ready for the answer. So in our case, adopting in the US, we decided that was not going to be the path for us. The reason why is that, for example, if you agree to adopt an infant in the United States, the birth mother has up until 6 months after the birth to change her mind, which I understand and support. However, for myself and for my wife as an adoptive parent, once we've received that child and have started to bond, and then to give it up after 6 months, that was a deal breaker for us.
So, if I understand this correctly, it's not the birth mother being allowed to keep the child up until 6 months after putting it up for adoption, but to think about it, it's after passing the child to adoption, maybe already having been adopted by another family, that they can still take it
They
back.
can still change their mind. And so for us, that was a deal breaker. So we also looked into fostering children in the United States, but we felt like we were, in that arrangement, we were sort of betting against the biological parents' success. And what do I mean by that? In a lot of cases, there's something where they have a criminal background or drug abuse background. And so their kids are put up for adoption, for foster homes. And you can take on those children as a foster parent. And if that parent gets off drugs, is released from prison and shows that they can live in society as a law-abiding citizen, then they can claim to get their children back. But if they don't succeed, if they don't get off drugs, if they stay in prison, then the path is cleared for us to adopt that child legally. But for us, that didn't feel right because we felt like if you, the biological parent, fail, then we will succeed as adoptive parents. So that also felt very strange to us. So thanks to seeing our friend with their Japanese adoptee, we thought, well, let's look at Japan because we have the strongest connection of why we want to adopt from that particular country. My wife is Filipino American. We looked into adopting from the Philippines, but there was a strong religious component. We had to have an endorsement from a priest in order to adopt, and we didn't have a relationship with a priest who knew us that well, so that we didn't move forward with that. And so because of our encounter on July 4th, we thought, well, let's try Japan. Because I speak Japanese, I have a history and close connection with Japan, so that seemed like the natural choice.
At that time, before we continue talking about your adoption process, what was the situation like in Japan for children that are up for adoption? Is there a system like you just mentioned in the United States of foster homes, or what kind of children are up for adoption, generally speaking, and where are they housed until then?
So that's a big issue in Japan and has been for some time. So as we just saw in the newspapers recently, Japan's population is shrinking increasingly. Mm-hmm. However, the number of children babies and children who are living in institutions in Japan stays relatively constant. It's about 35 to 45,000 children in Japan.
35 to 35,000 children are up for adoption,
are living in institutions. Mm-hmm. Very few of them are up for adoption. I'll explain why. So in Japan, you have what are called baby homes, and children and that's for babies and children up to age 3. After age 3, they're considered an older child, and they move into a institution for older children, and they stay there until age 18. So there, as I mentioned, about 40,000 of these children in Japan at any one time. And that's because even though Japan has a low birth rate, the people who do have children are like people anywhere else in the world. They run into mental illness or substance abuse or what have you. The difference in Japan compared to, for example, the United States, is that Japanese parents are very reluctant to give up their legal rights as biological parents. And also the way the system is set up, it's set up to promote the interests of the biological parents over their child. And so even if they're not able to parent in the traditional fashion, many parents retain their rights over the child and until that child ages out of the system.
Oh, so the child is in the system and is being housed in one of these institutions, but is technically still a legal dependent
Yes.
of the biological parent.
Yes, that's very common in Japan. And so the number of children who are available for foster parenting or adoption in Japan is quite small. Also, in preparation for this interview, and I'll include this link for the viewers of this, there was a very good documentary by Al Jazeera about Japan's throwaway children. And there's a segment in that documentary where an older couple is fostering a young girl. They've fostered many, many children over the years. But at one point in the movie, in the documentary, the young girl is in tears because her biological mother has asked that the girl be returned to her, but the daughter doesn't want to go. She feels a connection with the foster parents, but they have no rights in that situation. So the girl was returned to her biological mother, even though there may be issues still at home. So it's very, right now with the Japanese system, with the emphasis on the rights of the biological parent, that's the one of the major factors why it's so difficult to adopt in Japan.
So this is in a way then a similar situation than you had in the United States, where the birth mother can still kind of ask for the child to be returned up until 6 months. But here it's until the child is out of reaches majority. Right?
Yes, correct.
So you're back in the United States, you go through all this kind of security clearance, and then you, I guess, need to be partnered with an institution that has a potential child that is looking for a parent, but you're at the bottom of the list. Why would an institution send a child that was born in Japan, speaks only Japanese, be sent overseas? So what is the next step?
So I'll give you a bit of a background for that. So I worked very hard to put together all the paperwork because that was in my control. So starting in July of 2010 up through March of 2011, I put together all the paperwork, got all the fingerprints and everything. And then we submitted our packet to the adoption agency in the Bay Area, which then shared our file with a place in Tokyo called ISSJ, which is International Social Service Japan, which started after World War II to handle all the war orphans and in Japan. And usually it's about a 2-week turnaround for them to review your file and to say you've been accepted as adoptive parents. Now we will distribute your file to the child guidance centers, which are social service agencies in most metropolitan areas of Japan. And then their caseworkers will know the children who are available for adoption and try to make a match. But as I mentioned, I submitted our packet on March 10th, 2011. Next day was March 11th, 2011 in Japan. I had just submitted our paperwork, and I was checking Facebook, and I started seeing all these messages. There's just been this gigantic earthquake and tsunami here in Japan. It was around midnight in California. I watched the news and it showed, Fukushima being washed away by waves. And I thought, it's over. It looked, from our vantage point, it looked like Japan was being washed away. And I just thought, with all that's going on, our application will be lost, and or at least very, very low in priority, because the agency we work with in Tokyo doesn't do just adoption, but they also do relief work. So it was 6 months without us hearing anything at all about our file. And on May 6th of 2011, we got the response, which we had been accepted as adoptive parents. So that was tremendous relief to us.
So 6 months without hearing anything, and then finally you get a message that you're accepted.
Yes.
But that just means you're kind of in the database in a way.
We're in the database. We're in the hopper, in the funnel, as it were. And so then we began a long period of waiting, which when I was preparing for this interview, I had to revisit those times. For me, it felt like being in a completely dark room, not being able to breathe for 2 years or almost 3 years, because you don't know when the wait is going to end. When you're a biological parent and you get pregnant, 9 months later you'll have a baby. In our case, you don't know. It could be very quick. It could be even longer. So I know people who've waited up to 5 years. So it was a period where both for my wife and myself, time seemed to have no meaning anymore. And what I did during that time period, though, is to try to keep our presence known to the adoption agency here in Japan. So if I had business trips to Japan, I would visit the agency, and also I would visit the U.S. consulate in Tokyo, because they would be, they also were involved in our application process. They would be the ones to issue the visa to our son so that he could legally immigrate to the U.S. It was during, I visited the adoption agency here in Japan several times. And during my last visit, I had a very, very serious meeting with them, because it had been some time already. And the caseworker I was talking with said, well, can you broaden your categories a little bit? That will help in terms of increasing your chances to adopt. So up until that time, we had said up until age 3, boy or girl, but we had a very sobering discussion. So the first was about age, and so we changed the age up until age 8. And at the time, I remember feeling a little bit sad, because everyone wants to have a baby. And they also, many people think that adopting a baby offers the adoptive parent a kind of clean slate, because you're in control. I've since found through experiences with friends and also research that that child has experienced trauma by being separated from their mother. And so it's not always a clean slate. So that issue, I want to clear that up, that it's still a challenge as an adoptive parent. But also, I had to answer several other questions. For example, if the birth mother has abused drugs, would you accept that child? If the birth mother is alcoholic, if the child is the product of incest or rape, would you accept that child? So I said yes to almost all of those. The one, again, it's very strange as an adoptive parent, because it's almost like I had this strange sensation of sort of picking options on a car. Like, do I want leather seats or vinyl? because I'm choosing which one of these things can I live with. The one that was very hard for my wife and myself is about the alcoholic abuse, because at one point we had looked into adopting from Russia, and when that was still possible. Putin closed that down several years ago, but something they made very clear is that fetal alcohol syndrome is a very serious and common risk amongst adopted children in from the former Soviet Union. So you have to be prepared for that. We didn't feel that we had the family resources, the financial resources to be able to provide that child with the support he or she needed. So to the question about alcohol abuse, we had to say no.
At that point in time, you were discussing with the agency. You said you would visit them in person every time you had a business trip to Japan, and they were asking if you'd broaden your choice, so to say. One of the things that put you at the bottom of the wait list was being an international or foreign couple living overseas.
Yes.
And I can imagine also for a child, suddenly you have to get on a plane at a young age and you've flown to another country. Different culture, different environment, different climate, different everything might be one of the most difficult things. Had you considered moving back to Japan to adopt while living in Japan?
In terms of my qualifications, if you will, for to our appeal to be adoptive parents, I emphasize my connection with Japan, my history with Japan, the dedication to raising that child in a bilingual environment, the fact that we lived in the Bay Area where there are numerous Japanese language schools. So, and my work involved Japan very closely. So that's what I emphasized. At the time when we adopted our son in 2013, we were somewhat fortunate because there was not this additional requirement which the Japanese government instituted in 2018, which is called the nurturing period. So now if you're an international adoptive couple and you want to adopt a child from Japan, you must live with that child in Japan for at least 6 months, up to 18 months.
Wow. Okay.
So the U.S. State Department has a very good website about international adoption and statistics for each country. And overall, international adoption has been crashing for all countries. It reached a peak in about 2004. But as you mentioned earlier about Korea, there's been a lot of problems with Korea. Korea used to be a major source of adoptive children. So with all these countries and all their governments saying, this process has to be monitored much more closely, there are a lot more regulations in place, which is as it should be. But for American couples that want to adopt from Japan, this nurturing period requirement is very difficult. So since 2020, of course, we had COVID in between there, but since 2020, there's only been one child adopted by American parents from Japan. Japan was never a major source of adoptive children. Probably about 25 to 40 children were adopted by American couples each year prior to that. But it's shrunk a lot due to this requirement. I know there's a number of couples or families, military families based in Japan with the U.S. military who do adopt Japanese children because they already live here. And we did not consider moving to Japan to adopt a child because that requirement for cohabitation wasn't a thing at the time. So I emphasize my background and our strong desire to raise him or her in a bicultural, bilingual environment. Nowadays, though, if you're if you're an international couple that wants to adopt out of Japan, I would say if you would have to move to Japan in order to make that work, because the nurturing requirement is quite stiff.
So that leaves mostly domestic adoption within Japan. You at that point in time, you didn't have that requirement. You're still waiting. But historically speaking, how common are adoption in Japan? You mentioned the institution that you kind of got in touch with was established after the end of World War II, where there were a lot of war orphans. But is there anything before that where it was maybe common to adopt children, or uncommon?
Yes, so actually I came across a white paper when I was doing research, and I'll share that link as well. Interestingly, in the 1950s, so in the post-war environment, adoption of children in Japan, the rates of adoption of children in Japan and the US were roughly the same. And then it started to drop. And so in Japan, the rate of adopting children that are not your blood relative is very, very small in Japan, compared to United States and Canada. Certainly the war had a lot to do with that. There were many, many children who were war orphans, or the product of relations between US soldiers and Japanese women who were unwanted. So many people, comparatively speaking, many people came forward to adopt those war orphans during the 50s. But as Japan rebuilt after the war, that mentality started to shift. And people who thought about adopting a child that wasn't their own has really shrunk. And there's three issues or three reasons for that. One is many people in Japan are simply not aware that they could be adoptive parents. Secondly, the process for adopting is not well advertised, is not well known or promoted amongst government agencies in Japan. And also there's still a cultural barrier against adopting a child who's not your own blood. Historically, children, especially adult males, have been adopted by families in Japan going back many hundreds of years, mainly to keep the family name alive, or if that son had a particular skill that would be useful for running the family business, for example. So we have that history.
I was actually, there's a entire Wikipedia page on the topic. I think the Japanese term is yoshi engumi.
Yes.
Right? It's for when you want another heir for your family business, or your, back in the days, maybe your daimyo family.
Yes.
And one common example that is often cited is the Suzuki, the car maker or motorbike maker, that has kept the name in the family, so to say, but none of the Suzuki leaders are actually blood related. So
Yes.
It's quite interesting that it's relatively common and accepted to adopt someone into the family to keep a business going, but less discussed when it comes to adopting children in need.
Yes, and Japan is rather unique in that, because China and Korea also have long history of adopting males, but in those cases it's adopting males like a nephew or something like this as your son. Japan is rather unique in that depending on that young boy or that young man, they would adopt that person into the family even if he was not a blood relative. So Japan's unique in that. and but Japan's very unique in the sense that adopting a child who's not your own is still still a cultural barrier to that, and that's the reason why that most children who are adopted by Japanese couples tend to be under 1 year of age because they want to look as though it is their own biological child.
What happens to children that are not adopted?
In the case of Japan, I would say that the institutions where these children live are very usually quite well run and safe, unlike other countries where the conditions are quite awful. The issue comes where if those children are not adopted, they don't have the support of their families. They don't. Oftentimes, they don't go to university because the state's obligation to them is to raise them to age 18, and then they become members of society. But unfortunately, they usually don't have any sort of advanced skills or and that is quite an issue for them in terms of job opportunity and, as I mentioned, chances of getting married, etc. Again, this documentary that I'll mention about from Al Jazeera, they focus on one gentleman in particular who is facing challenges because of that background. So the children who are not adopted tend to be institutionalized, and but they don't have the same opportunities that children who grow up in a family have. So recently there was a change in the law where for foster parents, where the focus is more on giving the foster parents assistance and raising awareness, so that the focus was on getting that child into what's called a forever home or forever family. So up until then, foster parents were sort of disincentivized to for their children to graduate, as it were, because they get a stipend for that child. And so the longer they have that child, the better for them financially. But in terms of the child's development and sense of belonging and sense of belonging to a family, that was not optimal. So now the thinking is shifting towards getting that child into a permanent family environment.
Do you remember the day you got the call that
Yes.
a child would potentially be a good match for your family?
I'm I'm trying not to tear up because it was I remember the day and the time. So actually I was here on a business trip in Japan. It was the morning of July 1st, and it was about it was very early in the morning. My wife called me because she had gotten the call from the agency in the Bay Area saying we'd been matched with a young boy. And we just cried for about 15, 20 minutes because the wait was over, and also we finally get to meet this person. And it was also a little bit scary because it's like, okay, now you're parents, now your job begins. And that was July of 2013. And we didn't actually physically meet our son until November of 2013. So there's they set expectations with the little boy, And also, we have to make arrangements through the U.S. Embassy for his visa. And also, he received a stipend from the Japanese government. They had to withdraw that money from the bank. There was various steps that had to be done.
How old was he?
He was 8 years old at the time. And November of 2013, we flew from the Bay Area to Osaka to the home where he was living. And we were let into the reception room. And there was a door to the reception room which had frosted glass. And all of a sudden we saw this silhouette of a little boy's head. And then the door opened and there he was. And he was a little bit nervous. We were all very nervous. He instantly bonded with me. Within 15 minutes, we already had a rapport. It took longer in my wife's case for him to bond with her. Prior to the interview starting, I mentioned that we're still in contact with a couple of the caregivers who took care of him when he was living in the institution, and we're still in touch with them. But he had very, very good relations with these two women. And I think it was very hard for him to understand that that love is not a zero-sum game. So you can still feel that attachment for these two ladies who were essentially his surrogate mothers. And to love a new mom. But it took him a long time.
8 years old, that's already an age where he can talk. At the time he
Yes.
spoke Japanese.
Yes.
Also when you're quite aware of what's going on.
Yes.
And if someone explains to you, well, we found new parents for you,
Yes.
and you're going to be moving to the United States,
Mm-hmm.
you are somewhat able to process some of this.
Mm-hmm.
How was that transition then? You meet the boy and you bond with him, and then I guess you spend maybe a few days in Osaka to
Mm-hmm.
kind of get used to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But comes the time he has his visa, you're flying back to the Bay Area, and suddenly he's in a country where he doesn't speak the language. Everything's new, everything's different.
Mm-hmm.
Food is different.
Mm-hmm.
How did that go?
So that was a very tough period. So at first, he was very excited about going to America. And we all had to do some adjustment. So first, for me, I was thrilled to be a parent, obviously. But also, there was part of me, to be very honest, that thought, oh, he's 8 years old. We've missed out on, a lot of that tininess and cuteness. Looking back on it, there was still a lot of that left. I didn't need to have that sort of selfish worry. But for my son, there's the idea of going to America, and then there's the reality of going to America. So we were staying in a guest house near his institution for about 3 weeks. And that was very idyllic because he lived with us during the day. And then in the evenings, he could go back to his old home. And he lived in a group home where it's broken up into individual units of about 10 to 12 kids each. And so he had his friends there. So he could go in the evening and go play with his friends. And it was very nice. But when it came time to now leave for Tokyo to get his visa and then to return to California, that's where he started getting very scared and very angry. And the day that we left the institution, it was a very emotional day. Everyone turned out. All these, if you can imagine, in the courtyard was filled with children and caregivers. Everyone's in tears. The ladies I met for dinner last night, they were there too. They were sobbing. And we got into the van and headed back to Shinosaka Station to take the bullet train back to Tokyo. And I remember very clearly my son saying, you know, I could jump out the window right now and of the van and go back home. And we got back to Tokyo, and gosh, what a stressful time. Because he had grown up without parents, he didn't have that sense of bonding. So he didn't feel, most children who've grown up with a mother and father, they stick to the mother and father when you go in public. He was independent. So, for example, he loves towers. So we took him to Tokyo Tower and Tokyo Skytree. The day we took him to Tokyo Skytree, it was the day before we were leaving for the US. And we got there, and he immediately ran off from us. He did a lot of this running off because he felt free. I think he felt also nervous, and running gave him a sense of freedom. Well, Tokyo Skytree has many, many visitors. Mm-hmm. And something I tell my wife and my son is when we're in a crowded situation in Japan, with my hair color, I can wander off because you guys can always spot me. You two cannot because you have black hair. And so my son instantly disappeared. And we lost him for about half an hour. No idea where he was. Turns out he took the escalator up like 6 flights. We finally found him about 40 minutes later. The next day, we were boarding our flight at Narita Airport. And he had his passport around his neck. And with all the stress and tiredness, I had gone all the way up to the gate without returning my rental mobile phone. Mm-hmm. So I was talking to the agent at our gate saying, oh, I forgot to return my phone. What can I do? And my son said, I need to go to the bathroom. And the bathroom was right behind me, like 10 meters behind me. So I said, okay, go to the restroom, but come right back. So I took care of this mobile phone. The agent said, I'll take it back to the office for you. And so that took maybe about 5 minutes. I turned around and my son was not there. So I went into the bathroom and his passport was sitting there in the stall. He was nowhere in sight. So I assumed the worst. He's been abducted or something. So I went madly looking for him. And nearby, there was a children's play center. It had stuffed toys and the like for kids to play with while they're waiting for the plane. Our plane was delayed because there was a mechanical problem. Imagine my horror when I came around the corner and I saw my son with this toy truck, and he's bringing it down on the head of this little boy who was much smaller than him. And I couldn't do anything about it. And he hit this boy on the head, and his parents were just livid with us. And so, why aren't you controlling your son? And I was just mortified. And looking back on it, my son was feeling helpless. He's never done anything like that before or since. I think he was feeling helpless and took it out on someone that was smaller than him.
Eventually you arrived to the United States. How long did this kind of process take for him to get used to living overseas and for you to get used to having a son, if I can phrase it like that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, he and I got along very, very well, almost from the beginning. So I still remember when we landed. We landed at San Jose International Airport, and we it took us a long time to get through customs because of my son, because he had a visa, and he had to go through the immigration process. So that took a while. And also it felt a little bit strange because uh, here our son was, I can't even imagine what it's like now with the current immigration situation, but our son was being treated somewhat, making sure that he was a legal immigrant. There was a lot of questions about this, which was very off-putting.
Mm-hmm.
And then we decided to put him into the local elementary school almost immediately, because we thought, well, he doesn't speak English, but might as well get started with that.
Yeah, just throw him into the water, so to say.
Yes. And luckily we lived in the Bay Area, so the school that he went to had children from 40 different countries.
That's pretty cool.
And they had people there to assist with, acquiring English. Of all those international kids, though, he was the only Japanese person. So there was no one who could speak Japanese at school. Later on, though, a couple of months there in another grade, there turned out to be a Japanese boy, and his mother just volunteered to interpret for him during a math class. So these sort of blessings came out of the blue for us, where he was struggling. He did very well in math because he had good education in Japan, but he wasn't understanding what was being taught at the American elementary school. So when this lady came forward and said, I'll sit next to him and translate, that was a huge blessing. But he was still very immature inside. When the last day that we were at his institution in Osaka, the head of the institution came over and said, I want you to understand how very young he is inside. I know he's 8 on the outside, but on the inside, he's an infant. You consider him to be 0 years old. And I remember kind of laughing. He said, no, I'm serious. He's very, very young inside, and you're going to have to raise him accordingly. And that was always I think a hard thing for me, because there was this dissonance between his physical appearance and then his inward self.
At that point in time, when he starts going to primary school in the United States and so on, is the adoption process finalized, or is it still like a trial period or something like that? I mean, you took him overseas, but is this that the process is finished?
It's not finished. So I'll talk about the state of California. So in the state of California, the adoption has to be finalized by the family court of the county where you live. And that process takes about a year. So it was October of 2014 where we had our court appearance, and there are many other families there with their adoptive child. And it was a very interesting situation, because the family court is usually they're usually there to hear cases about divorce or children who are in trouble. And then at the end of the day, they have all these adoptive families. So there's a lot of happiness and clapping. And so it was a very interesting experience for us. And what we get is a certificate from the state of California, which is shows that he's a naturalized citizen. It's issued by the state of California. It's his birth certificate showing that we are the official parents, and now qualified to apply to become a U.S. citizen. So what do I mean by that? So even if we were living abroad, if my wife and I had a biological child in Tokyo, for example, that child would legally be ours. However, when you adopt a child internationally, then you have the right to apply for citizenship for that child, which is a process that takes another year or so and costs about $300.
You mentioned after that day in court, you get a sort of birth certificate for him. In Japan, they have the family registry, the Koseki.
Yes.
Very important. It says which family you belong to and usually can trace back generations. And if you marry into a family, you have to make a new one and so on. What happens in that situation where a child is adopted, and also in this case, adopted internationally and moves abroad?
Yes. So that's thank you for asking that question. So in Japan, they have two types of adoptions. There's the regular adoption, and then there's the special adoption. So regular adoption is if you're adopting a child that through a blood relative. Commonly, grandparents adopt a grandchild, for example, and that is managed through the family court system in Japan, and that child remains on the family Koseki. So in the case of the special adoptions, this was introduced in 1988 here in Japan. So it's called a special adoption, and that's where you can adopt a child that's not a blood relative, and that naturally applies to international adoptive parents. So in our case, our son was removed from his biological mother's Koseki, and he has his own Koseki, which lists my wife and myself as the legal adoptive parents. So with the special adoption, any legal connection, any legal claim of the biological parent over the biological child is completely severed.
So the way I was reading about this a little bit online is the child must be legally recognized as an orphan.
Yes.
But orphan doesn't necessarily mean the parents are deceased. It means all legal ties are severed. So it could be they are deceased, but it could be they legally give up their claim, or
Yes.
a lot of other reasons.
Yes. The main reason for this, as was explained to me, is they don't want the child to have any problems in the future where the biological parent may make some sort of financial claim on the child, which can lead to all sorts of problems. So this is a relatively new thing, as I mentioned, 1988, where that sort of that connection through the Koseki, as you mentioned earlier, the Koseki is something that goes back many generations usually. That is broken, and then the child has his own Koseki with the adoptive parents listed on it.
You came to Japan in the 80s. After a few years, you went back to the United States, and then you decided to go on this long journey of adoption. You finally adopt your son, and you live together as a family in California, and eventually now you move back to Japan. What inspired the move back?
So one thing that I noticed immediately when we brought our son to the United States is that he had a lot of loss of freedom. In Japan, he rode the train by himself. He could ride his bike wherever he wanted. Especially here in Osaka, this is a very bicycle-friendly place. We've got good public transportation, it's very safe. Also, the schools are safe for the most part in Japan. In the US, unfortunately, there are school shootings, and it's not a likely thing, but it's not an impossible thing. And every day when I drop my son off at school, I would think, is today. It was a question. It always was a question in the back of my mind. What if someone comes on campus and does something? Another thing that I remember is that, I live in California. It's very much car culture. And various local governments have tried many times to get people to walk or bike. In the case of where we were living, my son's school was like a 10-minute walk from our house. And several times we got survey from the local government asking, what would it take for you to let your child walk to school or ride their bike to school? And it came down to two themes. One was, are you concerned about stranger danger, like someone abducting your child on the way to school? Or is it something related to traffic? And for my son, even though it was a 10-minute walk, he had to cross a major road with 2 or 3 lanes of traffic in each direction, and then a freeway on-ramp and off-ramp. So it's very heavily trafficked with very typical California traffic. Everyone's in an SUV, everyone's on their smartphone or whatever. And between our house and the school, our son had to cross something like 8 intersections. That's 8 opportunities to be hit by a car, or to have someone honk their horn at him, road rage or whatever. The likelihood of stranger danger, he does not run into 8 people waiting to abduct him.
Many cars.
But many cars.
So the decision was providing back or giving back some freedom of movement and some sense of security, and you made the move back.
Right. But, and sorry to interrupt, but the concern I had was our son is adopted. And so he's different. And I was very concerned about the issue of bullying.
In the US?
In Japan, if we were to move back.
So that would have been my next question. Yes. About how is it for him, or how was it for you as well, coming back here and for him to introduce you as his father,
yes,
and adoptive father,
yes,
in terms of, is this understood what it means when someone explains? Because you said it's earlier in our conversation that it's so little discussed within Japan that people don't even know so much about this. Was there bullying because he doesn't have
So that's a very good question. Fortunately, very fortunately in our case, there's in the US and in Japan, there's been virtually no discrimination or strange comments to us or to him about being adopted. We went through lots of training when we were in the process about how to deal with that. Fortunately for us, it's never been an issue. In terms of acceptance here in Japan, with him, it has not been an issue. With him getting bullied because he's the son of non-Japanese, that has not been an issue. The thing I was more concerned about with him is that he was still more immature compared to other kids of his age, and so I was just worried that there would be a difference there somehow, and simply because he tends to be very innocent and is very young at heart. And I was worried about other kids taking advantage of that. And occasionally cases like that arose. But the schools that I sent him to were very much aware of that. We had a difficult time finding school for him in Tokyo. When we were still in California and we were planning this move to Japan, I contacted something like 15 different international schools here in Tokyo. The reason I contacted the international schools is that I was worried about him going into a traditional Japanese public elementary school because I was worried again about bullying or a rigid mentality amongst the teachers. I think that maybe that concern was a little bit overblown. But I talked with his teachers at the Japanese language school in the Bay Area. I said, you know his personality. What do you think? And the general consensus was maybe he'd be better off at an international school and also keep up his English. So I looked at 15 different international schools. I made a critical mistake, though. He has a very slight physical defect. It's called arthrogryposis, which means that the tendons in his hands and in his feet are rigid, they're stiff. So he can do all kinds of things: play violin, play piano, hold chopsticks, write, type without any problem. But to make a fist like this, he can't quite clench his hands tightly.
So not a boxer.
Not a boxer. In fact, I remember one time in the US, he was taking Taekwondo and his teacher was like, make a fist, make a fist. I had to tell him he cannot make a fist. He's trying, but he can't make a fist. So they understood. But so I contacted all of these schools, and 13 out of the 15 said no, just over email. They thought that he would be developmentally behind because of his circumstances, and then this physical thing, they just said no. And that's when I discovered that the international schools are also not unlike the Japanese schools in that they want kids who fit within the lines and will succeed. They're not really set up to help children who are outside of the lines. And our son definitely was outside of the lines because he would need some support in terms of emotional development. And even though I told them he can type, he can write with this condition, a lot of people took it to mean that he had some sort of serious physical defect. That was very frustrating because also none of the people said, well, let's meet with you guys online or let's talk with you and like learn more about your family. Just said no. But two schools interviewed us. We came to Tokyo and we interviewed at two schools. And he started going to international school until after about 6 months, he said, that school's too simple for me. So then I arranged for him to join a Montessori school. And that was I have very, very mixed feelings about that experience. On one hand, the school was very open to him. And also, they were the ones who suggested that he take violin and learn piano. I had never considered it, and it opened my eyes to the assumptions I had made as an adoptive parent because I thought because of his condition, he wouldn't be able to play a musical instrument. They exposed him to it, and he plays beautifully. So I'm very thankful to them for that. However, one day, I remember this very clearly. I was in a very important client meeting, and I got this phone call on my mobile phone, and it was from the head of this Montessori school who said, I have serious doubts about him being able to go to high school, let alone college. And up until this moment, she had been very supportive of him, saying he's one of our star students. And I was stunned. I could not function for the rest of that meeting. I thought, why is this person saying this? Why the suddenness of this?
What was the reason?
I think the reason was
so there was no explanation beyond that.
There was
left you guessing.
Yeah, I have my thoughts about why. Perhaps they didn't want that our son to leave the school because I had during this time, again, my son had said, the academic program is not that rigorous. And also, it was a very small school. And for example, sometimes he would have lessons with his math teacher. They would be canceled because that teacher had to take care of someone else. And so after this happened several times, I started getting worried about his academic development. So I started looking into alternatives. And the head of the school caught wind of that. I think she was not very happy with this.
But eventually it all worked out. Your son is in university now.
Yes.
You're still living here in Japan as a project manager.
Yes.
Throughout all this time, maybe looking back as well, did you feel like there were resources available to help you, a community of other adoptive parents that kind of exchange information, bonded over some of the challenges of welcoming a new child in a family? Or have you seen a change in maybe things being more available now than they used to be back then?
Yes. So actually, once we moved to Japan through social media, I was connected with several families, international families here in Japan who've fostered and adopted Japanese children here in Japan. So that was a huge resource to me because they would guide me on what to do about Japanese school, because I find that I've been through several transitions in my life in Japan. When I first came here, I was a single person. Then I came to Japan as a married adult. Now I'm in Japan as a father. You see Japan very differently through when you're in those different states. And I realized I knew very little about the Japanese school year and sports day and requirements for enrolling my son in school. Even things like his pass to commute to school. I thought it would be renewed on his birthday or whatever. No, it's renewed with everybody else in March of that year. So that whole thing about group mentality and as it relates to education in Japan was reinforced to me very strongly as an adult, as a parent. So having those people here in Japan give me advice was very, very helpful. Thanks to social media, I was able to connect with them because these people live all throughout Japan. We've never physically met, any of us, but they gave us, my wife and me, huge amounts of support in advising us what to do in terms of getting him prepared for school, and the like. Also, when he was in California and then when we were here in Japan, been very fortunate in being able to find Japanese speaking mental health counselors, so he could talk to them about any concerns he has. So that's been very, very helpful as well. And then in terms of the adoption agency itself, for example, a couple years ago now, I was invited to come and speak before 3 or 4 couples, all Japanese, who are considering adopting a child here in Japan, and what my experience was like. And I was very encouraged because all the couples were Japanese. So it means that, or it showed me that awareness and that acceptance is starting to grow little by little here in Japan. It's still not widely known, but it's a beginning, and I'm hoping to participate in that more often in future.
And maybe in the future, that number of 30 to 35,000 children that are currently in institutions will decrease, and more of them will find a family.
Yes.
Andrew, thank you so much for coming and sharing your story.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Do you feel like there's anything about your story, about adoption in Japan that we didn't really get into, that I didn't ask about, that you would have liked to share today?
You had asked a question about should adoption increase, or should more children be adopted in Japan? And this is not just a Japan only, but I think also relates to adoption in general. Because there's been more of this discussion about helping the biological parents to succeed. I think that especially in the old days, especially with if the child was from a poor family, there was this assumption that if you were adopted by rich parents, you should be very thankful for that, and you were given this chance, and you're much better off. Now that mentality is shifting, and much more effort is being put into helping the biological parents to succeed, giving them the resources they need, which is something I support completely. However, one of my mentors, she's lived in Japan since the 70s, and she has adopted several children and now is a grandparent. So she's got this multi-generational adoptive family. She said something to me that really stays with me to this day, which is the biological family is best until it's not. And what that means is that if there's serious problems at home there, then it's time to look at other alternatives. There are people who very much want to adopt. There are people that want to open their hearts to children, give them a loving home. Those people tend to fall into two camps. There's sentimental and there's altruistic. So sentimental is more about your own desire to become a parent, and you see this child in need and you think, well, I could be his parent and give them a good family. Altruistic is more about, and this is I've seen this come up more often now, where especially young couples decide at the outset, we are going to adopt a child, even though we probably could have our own biological child, but because there's a need in this world and there are children who need families, we will pursue that as our first option. And I wanted to take advantage of this podcast to make people aware that adoption is an opportunity to give a child in need as I mentioned, a forever home, a forever family, an opportunity to blossom into their best self, to provide them the love and attention that they would not have growing up in an institution. And then also, on the other hand, if there's any people out there that are considering adoption, but it seems scary or overwhelming, it's possible to do it. I think if you're interested in adopting a child in Japan, it's much better if you're already living in Japan, because you're connected with the systems and bureaucracies here in Japan, and it also alleviates that sort of concern about shocking the child too much by making this transition to a foreign country. can stay in Japan, albeit with a non-Japanese couple. So that was my goal and my great honor to participate in this podcast, to even if there's one couple out there that hears this and says, okay, we're going to adopt a child and make a difference in that child's life, then I'll feel very happy for that.
Well, thank you for coming again all the way to Osaka to talk about this topic. I know it's very sensitive, it's very personal to you.
Yes.
And we talked about a lot of your journey, how you experienced it, the processes you went through. You mentioned a few resources along our conversation. We'll make sure to have the link in the description.
Yes.
And also a way for people to contact you if they have more questions, because I'm sure we could have gone deeper into certain aspects of each of the things we talked about today. But I think we got a good general idea of what it's like, what adoption is like here in Japan, and how it works. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll be back in the next episode. Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future conversations. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed this episode, here are a couple more that we think you'll enjoy. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you next time.